Modern studies repeatedly suggest that a significant proportion of people in the Western world now believe in reincarnation. Although this phenomenon can be traced back to various esoteric movements that flourished from the second half of the 19th century, it gained significant ground with the explosion of popular interest in Eastern spiritual approaches in the 1960s, and it was reinforced by a proliferation of therapists offering to regress people into their past lives. Yet now, the tide seems to be turning again. For some years, the emphasis has been moving more towards the idea that we are all part of one, the all, the source, the absolute, the ultimate, the great spirit, or whatever we choose to call the universal consciousness. Of course, this is not a new idea, but what is changing is that especially more intellectually minded spiritual seekers are tending towards the view that anything outside of the one is mere illusion. In fact, this word illusion is used a great deal in spiritual circles these days, although actually in quite different contexts, and it is perhaps worth considering what these are. Of course, listeners would all agree that the physical world itself is to some extent an illusion, at least in as much as it's underpinned by the non-physical planes and states of being that science is increasingly pointing towards anyway. But what about the idea that we only reincarnate for as long as we fail to see through the illusion, and that as soon as we gain enlightenment, we can break the bonds of karma and reunite with the source? More radical still, what about the idea that any notion of individuality is completely illusionary on all levels, and that as soon as we die, there is no sense of continuation of any sort of individual soul consciousness? Whether or not they make it explicitly clear, these two are illusion models, supported by a significant proportion of our best-known spiritual commentators of modern times, be they proponents, for examples, of the power of now, or of cosmic ordering, or of quantum mysticism. Yet, to see the world in this way is entirely at odds with what we might call the experience model, which holds that we lead many lives in order to see all sides of every emotional coin, and to learn to deal with the manifest challenges that life on this plane provides. In other words, a model in which the emphasis is on an individual soul growing by experience over many lifetimes. Now, if we adopt a rational approach then, rather than relying on revealed wisdom, ancient or modern, it's surely sensible to consider which of these models is best supported by logical analysis and the available evidence. So if we start with the premise that there must exist some sort of ultimate force or energy that underlies the entire universe, both the seen and unseen, which is the origin or source of everything in it. However ineffable it may be, this principle of a universal consciousness is almost a logical necessity, and it's certainly supported by scientific research at both the quantum and macrocosmic level. The idea that we are all one is also a common element of transcendental experiences, whether spontaneous, meditative, or induced by hallucinogens. So, our next step must be to investigate whether, at the same time, there is actually any real evidence to support the idea of an individual consciousness that exists or survives independent of the physical body. And I suppose the most relevant area of research here is the near-death experiences. In particular, I'm interested in cases that involve subjects returning with factual information that is subsequently verified, and yet so obscure that they could not reasonably have acquired that information in any normal way. One of the most fascinating cases on record took place in the early 1970s and involves a gifted young Russian scientist called George Rodoneya. His work on chemical brain transmitters was sufficiently valued by the KGB that they were not prepared to lose his expertise to the US by letting him take up an invite to further his research at Yale. On the same day of his departure, as he stood on the pavement in Tbilisi waiting for a taxi to the airport, he was deliberately mown down by a car and pronounced dead at the scene. His body lay in a morgue for 3 days, but as the autopsy began, his eyelids flickered and he was rushed to surgery. As a man of science, George had never any time for religion, so those close to him were bewildered when 3 days into his lengthy recovery, he began to describe what had happened while he was dead. In fact, his was a relatively non-typical and highly transcendental experience, but for current purposes, he also claimed he'd also been able to travel anywhere he liked while out of body. In particular, he was drawn to a newborn baby in the hospital adjoining the morgue because she would not stop crying, and doctors had been unable to diagnose the problem. Much to his surprise, he found that he was able to communicate with the baby telepathically and also to scan her body and establish that her hip had been broken, probably at birth. Incredibly, as soon as George was well enough to pass on this information to the doctors, they x-rayed the baby and found that she did indeed have a fractured hip. Now, there are other similar cases of near-death experiences involving obscure factual information that combine to strongly suggest that our individual awareness or consciousness does indeed continue to exist, even when the physical brain is absolutely non-functional. But is there any evidence to support the further idea that individual souls have many lives? Well, there are two important areas of research. The first involving children who have spontaneous memories of past lives, although historically most of these cases have come from Asia. One of the finest involves a young American boy called James Lane Ginger of Lafayette, Louisiana, born in 1998, and his fascination with toy planes from the earliest age took a more sinister turn as he approached his second birthday, when vivid nightmares began. He would thrash around in his sleep, kicking out his legs up in the air and moaning, "Airplane crash, on fire, little man can't get out." His mother Andrea had no particular religious convictions, but when her mother suggested these might be memories of a past life, she began to encourage James to talk about them, and he began to reveal startling details, such as the pilot of the plane was called James, that he'd been shot down by the Japanese, that he'd flown Corsairs, and that one of his fellow pilots went by the name of Jack Larson. He also mysteriously mentioned the single word Natoma. Now, his father Bruce remained very dubious about any sort of spiritual explanation, but he knew that neither he nor any other member of his family had any particular interest in aircraft or indeed the war. So he began to research and quickly established that an aircraft carrier called the USS Natoma Bay had been stationed in the Pacific during World War II and had taken part in the notorious Battle of the Japanese island of Iwo Jima early in 1945. So the father ordered a book about this and was slicking through it one day when James pointed to the island of Chichijima on a map and exclaimed, "Daddy, that's where my plane was shot down." The dad then made contact with Natoma Bay Association, who actually confirmed that Jack Larson had been one of the pilots, and also that only one pilot had been lost at Chichijima, 21-year-old Lieutenant James M. Hudson Jr. Bruce also knew that Hudson had flown Wildcats and not Corsairs on Natoma Bay, but when he made contact with Hudson's elderly sister, she kindly sent him some photos, including one of her brother standing proudly next to a Corsair. Military records then showed that he'd actually originally been part of an elite special squadron who test flew these planes, but the real clincher involves 3 G.I. Joe dolls. When Bruce asked his son why he called them Leon, Walter and Billy, he replied, "Because they greeted me when I went to heaven." Again, military records confirm 3 of Hudson's fellow Natoma Bay pilots were Lieutenant Leon S. Connor, Ensign Walter J. Devlin and Ensign Billy R. Peeler, and that all 3 had died before Hudson on other engagements. The second part of past life research is hypnotic regression. With this, we must first appreciate that the human brain appears to store a complete record of everything we've ever been exposed to, no matter how briefly or how long ago, and although most of these memories remain inaccessible to our normal consciousness, they can be accessed in a trance. So apparently authentic and detailed past lives, even including strong emotions and strange accents and so on, have sometimes been proved to come from perfectly normal sources, not least historical fiction, which is often overlooked by spiritual researchers. Nevertheless, there remain some cases involving information so obscure that only a paranormal explanation seems appropriate. One example is of a young woman dubbed Jane Evans, who was one of the many subjects regressed by Welsh hypnotherapist Arnold Bloxham. She first visited him in the late 60s and proved a responsive subject who, over a course of a number of sessions, regressed into 6 separate lives from Roman times onwards. She would go on to star in the 1976 documentary made by the initially sceptical BBC producer Geoffrey Irvison, entitled The Bloxham Tapes. Her most celebrated past life was that of a persecuted Jew in the 12th century. But on close investigation, this case is somewhat inconclusive, and in fact her strongest life in terms of obscure evidence involved Alison, a young servant to the 15th century financier and merchant Jacques Coeur. Some of the historical information Jane came up with in the trance was relatively obscure and could only be verified by professional French historians. For example, she said that Charles VII's nickname was Heron Legs, and that his son Louis had poisoned his wife, and that his mistress Agnes Sorel had 2 pet dogs clothed in coats of white fur with jewelled collars, and that Coeur was Jewish and his father was a goldsmith. Perhaps more impressive was her knowledge that Coeur was an avid collector of art, with paintings by Jean Fouquet, the court painter to the king. There are other similar cases of both childhood recall and regression that involve equally obscure yet verifiable information about past lives. But could all these merely result from subjects tapping into some sort of universal memory, or even from possession by the deceased? Probably the strongest evidence that these are indeed memories from the subject's own individual past lives come from subjects also being regressed into the time in between lives. Now, this in-between life stems from research of a number of pioneering psychologists and psychiatrists around the world who each stumbled into the between life independently in the 70s and 80s. Their subjects' reports are extremely consistent, so that the experience can actually be broken into 5 main elements: transition and healing, past life review, soul group interaction, next life planning, and returning. This evidence from what now constitutes thousands of subjects from diverse backgrounds suggests strongly that there is a continuity of individual soul identity across many lives. So how do we properly bring this evidence of individual soul survival and reincarnation together with the idea of universal consciousness that underpins everything? Although the most profound spiritual sources have hinted at the truth throughout the ages, the most simple yet elegant solution has only become available to us in recent decades with the discovery of the hologram. And it involves applying this principle not to the brain, nor to the memory, nor even to the universe as a whole, but instead to soul consciousness itself. Soul consciousness is holographic. We are both individual aspects of the source and full holographic representations of it, all at the same time. However, this does not mean that the soul individuality is in itself an illusion. The principle of the hologram is that the part contains the whole, and yet is clearly distinguishable from it. The other message that comes through loud and clear from the in-between life research, as well as from most profound spiritual sources, is that free will and personal responsibility reign supreme. This is what allows us to learn from our mistakes and to grow as souls. So any next life previews seen between lives merely represent major probabilities and lesser possibilities, and there is no karmic punishment or predestiny. Indeed, the idea of karma itself has arguably outlived its usefulness, because it's clear that the dynamics of how our attitudes, intentions and experiences feed into the futures we create for ourselves, both across and within lives, are far too complex to be reduced to simplistic laws. So in summary, it appears that there are no flaws in the grand plan. The physical world is not an abomination created by fallen angels, nor is reincarnation cycle something to be escaped from at all costs, either by suddenly gaining the enlightenment to see through the illusion, or by learning to give up all attachment so as to generate no more karma. Although we would do well to aim for a degree of emotional detachment and balance, and regular meditation is, I believe, absolutely invaluable in trying to bring our higher selves to the force. Life is to be lived and experienced. So, where does it all end? Well, in between life evidence, again backed by most profound spiritual sources, suggests that we continue to reincarnate until we have exhausted all possibilities for growth in the physical plane. And this is only the end of the beginning of the soul's journey, because there are many other opportunities for new experiences in other realms. As for the idea of reuniting with the source, the concept of the holographic soul suggests that we never split off from it in the first place, and that it is always within us and us within it.